I'm a big believer in second chances, even for people who commit serious crimes. Who deserves a second chance? Who gets one? And who decides? I'm Jessica Henry, and I'll be your host of Just Justice. I'm a former public defender, a professor of justice studies, and an award-winning author. And I'm excited for us to find new ways to put justice back into our criminal legal system. Hello, and welcome to Just Justice. My name is Jessica Henry, and I'll be your host. Today, we'll be talking with Kelly Savage-Rodiguez. In 1995, Kelly Savage-Rodiguez was making a plan to leave her abusive husband when something horrific happened. Her husband killed Kelly's 3-year-old son. Even more shockingly, Kelly was also charged with murder, convicted, and was sentenced to life without parole under California's failure to protect law that criminalizes parents' inability to protect their children. After Kelly served 23 years in prison, her life without parole sentence was eventually commuted by Governor Brown in December 2017. Kelly was released in November 2018. Since then, as we will hear in this compelling episode of Just Justice, Kelly has devoted her life to fighting against life without parole as a DROP LWOP coordinator for the California Coalition for Women's Prisoners, and also for Human Rights Watch National LWOP Leadership Council. When we use the term LWOP, that refers to life without parole. Kelly, welcome to Just Justice.
Thank you so very much. I appreciate you for having this discussion.
You know, Kelly, I'd like to just start at the beginning of your journey back in 1995, or maybe even a little bit before then. You had 2 very young children, and you were in a marriage with a partner who was abusive. And you were planning to leave. You had made a plan. You were going to move to your brother's. But just one day before you had planned to leave, something terrible happened. And I'm wondering if you could just share what happened that day.
So the situation started about 4 days before. I woke up in the middle of the night. I was sleeping on the couch because he had been gone all day, and I just felt better about that. Not being in the bed when he came home, not thinking anything of it. It's not something I did normally. And I woke up in the middle of the night to being tied to the couch, and he was trying to tattoo his name on my ankle. This is when I knew I needed to go. My mother was incarcerated at the time. My mother was incarcerated in and out my whole life, and I was making the plan with her support. My intention was to go visit my brother in LA for one last visit before I started at the local college the next week. This opportunity to go work at the college would allow the kids to go with me, and I didn't understand how the cycle worked or what it looked like for me as a individual to now gain access to more education. I had just completed high school. My ex-husband had not. I was pushing for him to do something more with his life. And unfortunately, all of those things were leading me down a dangerous road I didn't understand. As I was making the plan, we don't know exactly when he found out, but unfortunately, there was many different things that I did wrong following the escape plan set up by a hotline that I had called from the local school the day after the tattoo in the middle of the night. And with that plan, there wasn't the normal things that we see today. There wasn't a bus, there wasn't a dial-a-ride, there wasn't a taxi in that town. There was Greyhound every other day, and the intention was to leave the next morning on that Greyhound bus. And unfortunately, doing all the things that the Domestic Violence Center said to do to continue to allow life to look normal so that he would have somewhere to go back to. We were all going to LA. I was going to go shopping with my sister. I didn't know where she lived, so he couldn't know where she lived. And we were going to disappear. And unfortunately, we didn't make it. I didn't realize what a isolated situation I was in. I had no friends in the entire town. I had one friend at all in the entire area, but she had just moved out of town. And so the isolation was so real, and the ability to move and do things was so limited, unfortunately.
It sounds like such a terrible situation. And then you came home to the unthinkable, and your son was not responsive, and you called 911, and they came and they took him. And I guess what I don't understand is how did you come to be charged and eventually convicted of your son's murder?
So after fighting him for the phone and calling 911, he immediately then started CPR. I didn't realize that he hadn't tried to call any assistance before I'd gotten home. I went to run some errands. It was extremely hot. It was the middle of summer. So understanding that the justice system is not always in favorable of all folks. And so the very idea that the system that was set up to protect me and that I had unfortunately had way too many experiences with growing up where I never felt supported. So I didn't see them as an ally, but I knew that the truth was clear as day and that there was no way that someone could convict me of ever harming him. I made a conscious choice not to take some plea deals that I was offered, giving me 15 to life, 10 to life, and then a 10-year term. But I couldn't help my co-defendant finding out that he didn't try to call for help, that he called his mother in another state and not for assistance, and then fought me. I couldn't in good conscience do anything that would help him get out earlier. However, I knew it was jeopardizing me and the rest of my existence, but I saw no other choice. And so I chose to go to trial with 84 witnesses, had two people against me, his mom and his mom's best friend. And the reality is, it doesn't matter how much you try in life. If a prosecutor is going after a sentence, they have an ability to do what they want. My jury thought that after convicting me of aiding and abetting, that I would not go to a penalty phase. And when the judge said we were both going to penalty phase, they had some questions, and the judge had to tell them it doesn't matter. In California, if a jury finds you guilty, the only option that a jury has is life without the possibility of parole or a death sentence. And they gave me life without the possibility of parole. And I knew at that moment I had to figure out like who I was after a 4-month horrible trial where my trial was more focused on me than my son and my own upbringing, which was not good. I left home by 14. I was safer on the streets than I was in my home. I didn't have a first opportunity. So when I got into the system, I immediately started to change that. Regardless of where I was going to live, I had to do better. I had to understand how to stand up for myself. And I had to figure out that I had a right to that because I did the best I could, but my best wasn't good enough. And my abilities weren't good enough. And I lost Justin.
I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry because I can't imagine how painful it would be to be out running errands with an eye to leaving a terrible situation at home and only to find your son just unresponsive and calling 911 thinking you're doing the right thing only to get pulled in as if you were also equally responsible for having caused harm to your son. That's just such an awful thing to experience. I can't imagine.
Can I ask you just like to consider how you or maybe the audience would feel to have every myth and misconception about a person be brought up at a trial? It wasn't about justice, it was about a conviction. And so the TA's version was that I had moved on from wanting children because I was so focused on wanting to go to school to get off welfare. Like the very idea and truthfully, the audacity of a woman to sit there and blame someone for wanting to get an education. Mind you, no one would listen, that the kids would be going to school with me. My life goal was to have a daycare center and make sure that other little kids weren't hurt like I was. And unfortunately, my ex used that to punish me. And unfortunately, Justin paid the ultimate price. And when the system decided that incarceration was the only answer, they wanted answers from me. They wanted me to co sign what they said happened. And I wasn't there. And I knew better than to make up a version. I just wanted the truth. Let me give you all of the information and let you talk to my doctors, let you talk to all of the people that I've asked for support. I want you to hear from them. And the truth is, they didn't care. And I understand that the system is designed to support the victim, but sometimes they forget to look at all of the victims in the situation. And I shouldn't have been punished for surviving. I punished myself enough. I absolutely was blessed to have an opportunity to learn and grow while I was inside. I don't believe that I would have had that opportunity if I hadn't had started to make the plan to leave. However, I regret every day that I didn't make it out fast enough.
Yeah, I mean, you make such a good point because so often the system doesn't recognize domestic violence, intimate partner violence, and how that plays out in the context of a relationship. And you were sort of caught in the crosshairs of that. And of course, you were grieving your child and facing capital murder charges. Not at all an easy situation to be in, such a difficult state to get your head around, right? I mean, just awful. And so you get assigned a lawyer. Obviously, at that time, you didn't have the money to pay for a private attorney, so you got assigned a lawyer. And what did your lawyer do, or should I say, not do for you as you awaited trial?
My attorney felt that this case was a no-brainer. He refused to talk about anything around domestic violence. Everyone knew who the responsible party was. And so he really didn't have any defense. He didn't represent me in a way that would allow me to feel supported. I tried to fire him. I took many steps in order to remove him as my counsel, and unfortunately, nothing worked. I didn't know at the time that my judge was never going to remove him. Everything I had done was a circus act. My lawyer was finally disbarred for a meth lab that he had out of his home.
I want to make sure everyone heard what you just said. In this capital case where your life is literally hanging in the balance, you're being represented by a lawyer who's running a meth lab out of his house while he's representing you? Is that what you just said?
Well, we can't guarantee that it was during the trial. However, discovery that was confiscated from his paralegal, who was forced by the judge to provide me with some documentation. Unfortunately, that discovery was confiscated due to them following my paralegal, I guess, or his paralegal, who was supposed to be bringing me my documentation, but unfortunately got caught with the methamphetamines, not only in his vehicle, but still in the boxes he had left the office that had all of my discovery. The judge had mandated my lawyer provide to me. So unfortunately, not only did I never receive that discovery, they just proceeded on as if this was just happenstance that had nothing to do with my attorney. At this point, he had been removed from the DA's office after 2 DUIs. By the time he was disbarred, he had 5 DUIs as well as meth lab. But unfortunately, he had ran into a tree and caused brain damage to himself. He didn't harm anyone else. He harmed himself, falling asleep at the wheel while intoxicated.
Wow. So that was your lawyer, not off to a particularly good start. And then, you kind of alluded to this, but you had a childhood that was full of trauma. It was full of abuse. And it sounds like at your trial, that abuse was used not to help you in particular, not to contextualize what was going on, but actually to harm you. How did the subject of abuse come up at your trial?
My attorney felt that it was not a good idea to bring up the abuse, though it was so rampant in so many different areas of everyone's conversation that it was forced to be used. But the specialist, once again, at that Mar hearing, trying to fire this lawyer, the judge ordered a couple different things. One was a specialist be utilized to maybe talk about me and my life, just in case, as the situation unfolded. He refused to allow me to testify. I believed I didn't have a right because he told me that I shouldn't and that I was making things worse. And so I didn't testify. And so this person was representing me. But little did I know, unfortunately, that she had her own family dynamic and had very unethically represented me in this case and continued the myths and continued the misconceptions about what happened in my home because she was dealing with her own trauma around a very similar case of her own. Her own grandchild had a similar situation, and she was removed from Sacramento County Jail as a psychologist due to her own trauma. And so my lawyer thought it would be a good idea to allow her to work my case. Not only did she lie about how often she saw me, but she mentally messed me up extremely bad. I was afraid to seek help for myself and my own grief and my own trauma because of the way she treated me and the way she questioned me and things that she asked had nothing to do with my situation. And it wasn't until my appeal that I found out all of these different things. I knew my lawyer had been disbarred because they sent me paperwork and transcripts and discovery, which I must say was the biggest blessing of my life, that he was disbarred because I got the gift of pictures of Justin. He had taken every picture I owned and claimed he had sent it to family after the trial, and it was a lie. It was all in his office. And so I was blessed enough to receive my photos back, which is all I've got left. So extremely important. But in that, the lies and the trauma that he did to me by just not representing me at all. I mean, having the psychologist that he knew was never going to talk about domestic violence because if she did, they could question her about why her own daughter made choices. And so he had made a promise to her that they wouldn't discuss domestic violence in a situation that was clearly riddled with so many different avenues and so many different people talking about clear evidence from childhood, elementary school record of abuse to court cases to medical reports. There was just so many areas of abuse. Please understand, I'm not excusing the behavior and what happened to Justin. I just minimized my experience and his yelling and his disrespect and the way he treated me because it wasn't violent in the ways that I had seen. And he did not harm Justin in front of me. He would put him on timeout and punishment, and we would argue over whether that should happen, whether he had an infraction or not. And all of these things were to punish me. And so it just felt like the punishments kept coming. Not only was it from him at home, but as he said, if he couldn't have me, nobody could. Not Justin, not my family, not my friends, nothing. That was the last words he told me before I got the first piece of evidence after being in county for a couple days. And he meant it. He knew what he had done, and it didn't matter. The jury knew, the judge knew, the DA knew, they all knew. But they said I should have known he was capable of it. I should know that he started secretly smoking meth 3 weeks before and was spinning out of control. Everyone said I wasn't allowed to know, but I should have known that. I should have focused on him and not the kids. I should have focused on what he was doing so I would have known.
I mean, it just sounds like layers and layers of blame without any sort of compassion or even scientific understanding for your own personal trauma and trajectory for what you experienced and suffered. And it's sort of extraordinary to me that you were ultimately convicted. And I can only imagine when you first get convicted and they go into the mitigation part of the case. For listeners that don't know, in a death penalty case, there's a guilt phase where the jury gets to determine whether or not they think the person is in fact guilty of the crime. And then there's a penalty phase where they decide whether the person should be sentenced to die or receive an alternative sentence like life without parole. And in your case, you were sentenced to the alternative, to life without parole. And I don't know if you even had the capacity to understand what LWOP, what life without parole, really looked like. And I'm wondering, how did you feel when you first heard the sentence of LWOP? And what did you do to stay hopeful and motivated in prison when you were serving a sentence that seemingly had no end?
Well, at first, they kept saying there's no way. My lawyer, up until the last day, told my family there was no way that I would get anything more than 11 years at the very max. It wasn't a possibility, but he did do a lot of very shady things to pressure me to take the deals, setting up legal visits with no representation, just his attorneys and his counsel pressuring me to take the deal. I absolutely understand. He didn't want me to take it to trial. However, he also didn't do anything to do the work to not get me to trial. He kept saying, all we need to do is continue to point the direction where it needs to point. So when it came time to the penalty phase and to hear the jury speak up to say, well, no, not Miss Savage, just Mr. Savage, was shocking. And then not understanding the system, no one explaining anything. I saw my attorney 2 times. Now I saw a specialist for the penalty phase often, but my attorney 2 times to talk about that part. I had to inform him when they went after the death penalty. He didn't even inform me. My in laws informed me. And so there wasn't support. So I didn't understand anything about the sentence, but what I understood was prison. Unfortunately, all too well. And so when I got there, first I started working on me. My childhood is riddled with sexual abuse as well as physical abuse. I've lost my hearing due to this abuse and many other things, a child at a very early age, many, many different things. And so needing to learn me first and then understand the grief of it. And then I started working to educate myself and others about the LWOP sentence and realizing that both things needed to be understood. My domestic violence situation, and I helped create a domestic violence program that first started with presentations and then is still happening. But when I left incarceration, when I was commuted, the governor actually said that he hopes that I make sure that I put people in place that my group still continue. It's a 4-part curriculum of the basics of domestic violence, looking at boundaries, looking at incest and rape, and then looking at the batterer's perspective, both as a victim who can get into repeated patterns of we think there's a label on us that says, I'm a victim, come find me. And the truth is, we're taught not to learn boundaries at very early age. We're taught to respect adults and not to tell and all of these things. You're not supposed to tell on somebody else. You're a tattletale. You're all these things. And so when you go to tell and you're not believed or you're silenced because of truthfully financial gain or whatever, you continue not to seek that support. And so in creating that program, when I left, there was over 700 people on the waiting list. I don't know what it looks like now after COVID, but yeah.
Amazing. I think there's something so life affirming and powerful about finding ways to make a difference, even in places that can be so full of despair and darkness. And that's just one example, right? I mean, you did some fairly extraordinary things while you were incarcerated. You became a member of the California Coalition for Women's Prisoners, where you work now on the outside. But can you actually remember while you were on the inside? Can you tell us about the work you did with them there too?
Yeah, for 15 years, I was blessed enough to work with them. And after COVID, people might understand. My biggest accomplishment is access to toilet paper. And the reason is we had this big event with all these different senators and assembly people present in the institution, but I had been fighting for days to get access to toilet paper that was sitting right outside a gate that we could look at. Like we could watch it get rained on, but they wouldn't let us have it. They would search our rooms to make us give toilet paper to other rooms while we could see that toilet paper sitting in the sally port. And so I may have gotten searched many, many times after that, but I was able to get that yard. I didn't even live on that yard, but it was my mission to get them the support they needed because I was tired of them taking ours. And it just wasn't right. Like basic human rights are denied there every day. Like a sanitary supply on a yard is not even going to happen. So if you're stuck on the yard for an hour and a half and you accidentally start or have an accident, and you go to that porta potty, you're lucky if there's toilet paper there, let alone a sanitary supply. So it was those kind of little battles and then big battles like people who were dying that needed medical support. We created the grief, and then we got another institution to have comfort care, which is palliative life sustaining care and end of life care, both. And so we're blessed to do that kind of work too. And so all of these different ways that we were able to give back not only helped us feel better about right where we were going to be, because that's what LWOP says is you're never going home. You don't have a right to show anybody you're going to do better. You don't have a right to get into certain groups or educational programs or even jobs to support yourself. And so with that, you have to figure out what that looks like. And I unfortunately had addiction issues from a very, very, very early age, partly before my consent, and partly because it was easier to numb. And it was multiple different vices that I used, alcohol and drugs. And so I had to figure out how I was going to live my life in a system. I had access to drugs, but I had to choose not to stay in that mindset and not to numb and actually do the work and the healing. And CCWP, the California Coalition for Women Prisoners, was able to help me because they helped give me that voice, not only to talk mostly about everybody else's issues, so much easier to help support somebody else than it is to help yourself, 1,000,000%. We used to have to pay a $5 copay to go to the doctor. And I understand the community says, well, I have to pay a copay. That sounds okay out in the community where you can make maybe $200 a day. But when you make $20 a month, having a $5 copay and you have restitution, you're only getting $8 back after restitution and $5 of it goes to a copay. How do you make sure you have toothpaste and laundry soap so that the very basic needs are met? So when you're in that room with several other individuals, you're not fighting for your life again because you can't provide for yourself. And so fighting for things like that can empower anybody. And it definitely empowered me.
Yeah, I mean, again, for the listeners who don't know about the prison experience, prison is really a place of terrible deprivation. And so, particularly for women, access to things like tampons and pads and toilet paper at the minimum can be a very hard fought battle. It's not something that's provided in all cases in the appropriate quantities, if at all. And I'm so glad you're highlighting that here. And I'm glad you were able to use those fights to empower yourself and the women around you. That's a great lesson, I think, for all of us. And so there you are. You've sort of made your way in this system. You've gotten sober, You've gotten an education or as much access to it as you could. You've done programs. You've created powerful programs. And then finally, this thing happens in 2017. Governor Brown from California commutes your sentence. And I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about that process. I know that there was a California law that was passed, AB 593, that allowed people who had been victims of intimate partner violence and who hadn't been able to raise that as part of their defense to litigate that. And you were part of that, right? You started relitigating your case. So tell me, how did you get on the governor's radar and what happened?
Oh, there were so many ways I got on his radar. I got to say, I had amazing advocacy. When the bill first allowed us to look at the intimate partner battering, at first it didn't apply to me because it was only people that were incarcerated before 92. And then they branched it out to add people up until they were incarcerated in 96, because after that, they started looking at why it was important to allow for that educational component in trials and looking at domestic violence and why it was so important. But at the same time, I was so stuck on feeling like I wasn't worthy, and I really didn't feel like I had a right to see a future outside, not because I had done anything wrong, but because I had been so beaten down by the idea that it's my fault that I allowed him to be in that position. And the truth is, I was trying every avenue that I knew of to get out, and it just wasn't working. And so to continue to be punished for trying to survive is really difficult. And so, in trying to navigate through that, as I was willing to fill out the forms and I was going through the process, I just kept saying, but this can't be about me. It has to be about Justin. And Justin, my son who lost his life, it isn't about me, though it was to punish me. And so I needed to understand that and stop punishing myself. And in that, as I was taking those steps to understand, and I was in that active healing process, I did fill out the application. And when I was afforded an opportunity for a lawyer, I didn't realize that there was four legal teams that had been fighting for the last 2 months to take on my case. And so there was multiple discussions about who had the best access and representation to support me. And this was at a time when people were grasping at straws to get representation. And so the legal team that I got, I didn't even realize that they were technically learning and tax attorneys working on pro bono cases and bringing in criminal defending attorneys in to the work after they learned about me and the work. And so I had multiple lawyers in between 2012 when I won with the Court of Appeals. And they said that I needed to be afforded an opportunity back at my county, but my county just kept denying it. So we were back and forth in court from 2012 until 2017. And so in 2017, the attorney that had started the process had did so many amazing things. He worked both in California and in Texas and helped get multiple people off of different death sentences, both LWOP and death row. And so in that, he was trying to reach out to Sister Helen Prejean, who is a staunch advocate and works with Governor Brown at the time. And they had a meeting set up. Our now vice president going into president was also brought into the conversation on multiple levels. Her office, unfortunately, she did help create this bill. She used it on her platform, but unfortunately wasn't willing to stand up in the case. And so after 10,000 signatures, both to her office and to Governor Brown in less than 6 months, fighting towards my release, multiple meetings with the Attorney General's office, as well as attempted meetings with the governor's office, I was blessed to have an opportunity for an interview. My advocacy team through CCWP pushed my original lawyers to file for commutation, and they didn't want to do it. They wanted to continue in court, and they didn't want me to file for myself. They wanted it to be more legal based. And within 3 weeks of submitting my commutation, I was blessed enough with an interview. However, right now in California, we're dealing with an officer facing 99 counts of sexual assault. He is currently at trial. Actually, some of my friends and fellow residents are testifying today at his trial. And unfortunately, he was the officer to allow me to have this interview, and he wanted to go change shifts and go to a different yard and do work for the day. So he canceled my commutation interview. So basically, my first and only opportunity after 23 years of incarceration to talk about my situation, and I was canceled after 45 minutes. And even with those circumstances, I was still blessed to be able to have an investigator who was continuing to reach out to people. And I was blessed in November 23rd of 17 to receive a commutation from the governor. When that happened, I absolutely was shocked. I just kept saying, I'm not going to die here. I just can't believe I'm not going to die here. And that support helped others. I'd also created a LWAP group inside to educate each other about the movement at both institutions. I was transferred to a different institution right before the day I found out I was granted my appeal in 2012. And so I had the ability to affect many different people and offer them support. In fact, just this last month, I had a LWAP event in the same prison that I left, CCWF, with everyone serving the sentence to give them hope, to teach them how to advocate for themselves. They did posters teaching the world about who they are, because they're not just a number.
Amazing. And I mean, the truth is, we're so much better with you in the world than with you inside prison. And that's the truth about so many people serving sentences, is that they have so much to give on the outside, and they have the capacity to live productive, positive lives if they only had the opportunity. And again, your case is a little bit different because of those circumstances of the offense. But even for folks who perhaps were much more directly involved in the harm they caused, it's important to ask how much accountability in the form of a prison sentence, how much accountability do we really need in order to even up those scales of justice? It's such an important question. And, I do want to highlight that you've done some pretty extraordinary things since you've been released from prison. And I'm wondering, can you tell us what you've been up to now? You were released in 2018. What have you been doing?
I actually went to board 23 years to the day that he tattooed his name on my ankle. So it was like such a strange situation, and it gave me a whole different side of understanding. I had done more time inside incarceration than I had been out. I realized that having this ability to get out, it wasn't just about me. As I said, 10,000 people had signed petitions to fight for my release. And it wasn't just in California or just in the United States. Like, that was amazing to me, that people saw that rehabilitation can and does happen, and that most people haven't gotten a first opportunity. And so I knew for me, it had to be about continuing the movement. I just didn't know how I was going to do it. People tease me all the time that I talk about, how am I going to make a living out there? Like, my career choice was childcare. And now I thought I couldn't be around little kids at all. I was blessed to have advocacy and support to the point that I went to a program that had children in it, and that normally doesn't happen. And so it allowed me to see things so much differently, even though I had done all the training I'd done inside. I'd done 378 hours of domestic violence training, sexual assault training, trauma training, all these different areas of work. And I still came out to the community trying to do the same thing. I went to a domestic violence program that helped support my release to try to volunteer. I wanted to support somebody going to a program that I should have been afforded the opportunity to go to. I donated funds to the program that should have been able to come pick me up so that they had a vehicle to pick up the next person. Unfortunately, I never realized it was so far away to the location that their program was at from where I lived. I couldn't have understood that back then. We didn't have Google Maps like we do now where we can understand those things. But back then, I didn't understand. My heart was broken at what I had lost. And so I did all I could to do the trainings and to get the education out here so no one could say I was doing less than or that I didn't have the ability to support others. Unfortunately, due to the conviction, I did all the work to work for the Domestic Violence Center, but was unable to volunteer my time, which was really heartbreaking. But I do volunteer with the Women's Against Rape in San Francisco. Now I don't volunteer on a weekly basis as I used to. I now live in Southern California. I bought my own home. I've got a bachelor's degree. I actually went all the way to Switzerland to talk about death by incarceration and why it needs to end. My wildest dream was to go to New York because that was the farthest destination I could make on a Greyhound bus.
Going to Switzerland. And congratulations on that college degree. It's very impressive.
Yeah, and I leave in 2 days for New York on a flight, not on a bus, for my first couple days vacation and then a work situation.
Where is your ex-husband now?
He's currently still incarcerated as I fight this battle. I believe everybody deserves a second chance, and I hope he's doing what he's supposed to continue to deserve that second chance. He has to do what he needs to do better. And he has apologized. He has admitted it several times. It's part of court records. They know he did it. That's a shameful part about failure to protect and these laws that are just meant to incarcerate is they don't care who did it. They just want the most amount of people and they want a conviction. And don't get me wrong, I understand that justice has to be served, but how is punishing me for surviving the abuse justice? And there's so many more like me, people that weren't in the same state as a situation. It should be about individual accountability for a person's wrong, not about mass incarceration, not about your conviction rate. It should be about individual accountability. Society has chosen to believe that incarceration is the answer, but if people started to understand what it was really like in the system, they could see just how difficult it is. And that's not even going into how different it is for men versus women and how deprived women are of basic resources, support, and networking in ways that men have access to that. And so there is so many other areas of support, but just most importantly, that I'm not alone. And yes, it is 1,000% about people understanding that Justin's life was important. And yes, I chose to do better, but I chose to do better with hundreds of other people in there doing better as well, who are fighting every day just to get into self-help groups, into college, like hearing our LWAP population go from not